Imagine for a second that you are looking at this like ultimate pristine blueprint for human freedom. The lines are crisp, the math is perfect, but then you actually walk onto the construction site and it is just absolute chaos.
Oh yeah, complete mess.
Like the foundation is sinking, the materials are flawed, and the main architect just casually mentions he'd be completely fine with half the planet being wiped out if it meant the building got finished.
Right, which is just...
Today, we are walking onto that messy, chaotic construction site.
Yeah, and it is a far cry from the, the clean, sanitized versions of history we are so often handed. Because we tend to want the past to be straightforward.
Sure.
Like heroes over here, villains over there, and a nice, tidy resolution by the end of the chapter.
Right. Well, welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are immersing ourselves in a really fascinating collection of essays from the book The American Revolution at 250. It's edited by Francis D. Cogliano. And our mission for you, the listener, is to figure out why the American Revolution, an event that, feels so familiar to most of us, has become this massive historical battleground.
Because it really has.
It has. So we are going to dig into the contradictory, often uncomfortable, and honestly deeply relevant truths about the nation's founding.
And the essays in this collection do just an incredible job of peeling back those layers. I mean, they force us to confront the fact that the people who built this country were dealing with incredibly complex, very human realities.
Yeah. To really see the contrast, I was thinking about the 1976 bicentennial.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Right. For anyone who remembers it, or even if you've just seen the pop culture leftovers from the 70s, the framing was incredibly simple.
Very different vibe back then.
Totally. It's remembered for like McDonald's handing out placemats with cartoon founding fathers on them, tall ships sailing into Boston Harbor, and this very unified, slightly schlocky, feel-good celebration. But you fast forward to today, and the conversation is completely fractured. The authors in our source text point out that if you look at the modern landscape, we are basically pulled between two very distinct poles. On one end of the spectrum, you have something like the 1619 Project,
right,
which, centers the institution of slavery as the true origin point of the country. And then on the other end, you have the 1776 Commission, which advocates for a much more traditional patriotic education.
Which basically leaves the actual history caught somewhere in the crossfire of our current moment.
Exactly. And just to be super clear with you listening, our goal today isn't to pick a winner in that modern culture war. We are not taking sides.
Right.
We are simply tracking what the historians in our stack are observing, which is that the revolution has basically become a casualty of our current political climate. It honestly feels like we are watching a bitter custody battle.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Right. Two sides are fighting over an inheritance, but in the heat of the argument, they might have completely forgotten who the parents actually were.
And that is a crucial point. What emerges from the source material is that the founders, they never viewed themselves as flawless deities meant to be frozen in marble. They accepted human flaws as a fundamental baseline. So the real power of 1776 isn't found in pretending the past was perfect.
Right.
The power is actually in their radical utopianism.
Yeah.
I mean, they knew they were deeply compromised people building a compromised system.
Yeah.
But they consciously built a system that allowed for constant reinvention and change.
Okay, so if we want to understand how that flawed, messy reinvention actually played out, we have to look at the guy who practically defined the American ideal, but whose personal life was just a maze of dark contradictions. I'm talking about Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, Jefferson is the ultimate example of this.
The essay by Annette Gordon-Reed paints this vivid picture of him as a relentless, optimistic visionary. He was obsessed with progress, and you can see this physical manifestation of his mind in his obsession with architecture.
Right. He was a man who simply could not stop building.
Yeah.
The sources note he famously loved putting up and pulling down walls. He was just never satisfied with the way things were.
He would literally rent a house in Paris or New York, knowing full well he was only going to be there for like a year.
Right.
And he would still completely remodel the place.
Bear it down.
Yeah. And then, of course, there is Monticello. He spent decades having the top of a mountain level just to build his perfect home. Reading about this, he honestly sounds like a modern move fast and break things tech visionary.
Oh, entirely.
The type someone so intensely focused on an idealized, disruptive end product that they become totally blind to the human cost of their vision.
Right.
Because to flatten a mountain in the 18th century required horrific human cost.
Yes, it did.
The enslaved people on his plantation were the ones forced to physically carve away the earth to fulfill his design.
And that capacity to, separate the ideal from the brutal reality.
Yeah.
It extended far beyond his architectural projects. It was a core part of his worldview.
Yeah.
There's specific detail in the text that perfectly illustrates how terrifying his idealism could be. So in 1793, the French Revolution was descending into the reign of terror.
Okay.
Thousands of people were being executed. And Jefferson received a letter from his friend William Short, who was horrified by the bloodshed.
All right. Understandably.
But Jefferson's response is staggering. He wrote back that he would rather see half the earth desolated and only an Adam and Eve left in every country than see the revolution fail.
Wait, half the earth wiped out.
Half the earth.
That is genuinely chilling. I mean, it completely shatters the image of the quiet philosopher with the quill pen.
It does. Yeah. It reveals a man whose belief in American exceptionalism gave him the ability to draft this unparalleled blueprint for human liberty, while simultaneously giving him a frightening capacity to tolerate immense collateral damage. As long as it served the ultimate vision of progress, the destruction was justified in his mind.
Wow. So we have the main architect comfortable with staggering cognitive dissonance. But the sources show he wasn't alone, right? This wasn't just a Jefferson problem.
No, not at all.
There was this openly acknowledged hypocrisy regarding slavery woven throughout the entire culture of the colonies. And if you're listening to this, you might be thinking, well, it was the 1700s, it was a different time, maybe they just didn't know any better.
Right.
But Eliga H. Gould's essay completely dismantles that idea. The text shares a letter from 1782 written by Mary Middleton Butler. She was an incredibly wealthy South Carolinian, and her enslaved laborers had been confiscated by the British during the war. So she writes this formal demand to get her quote-unquote property back. But right there in the letter, she literally admits that these enslaved people are fellow creatures. She explicitly acknowledges her own moral double standard while actively fighting to keep people in chains.
It's wild. And we see the exact same thing from Henry Lawrence, another incredibly prominent figure in South Carolina.
Okay.
He wrote a letter to his son stating that he abhorred slavery. He knew it was morally bankrupt.
But he still did it.
Exactly. He justified his continued participation in the slave trade by blaming the avarice of my countrymen. The sentiment across the board is basically, we know this is wrong, but the economic system is just too profitable to dismantle.
It's as if they convinced themselves that simply confessing to the hypocrisy was enough to clear their conscience. Like, hey, at least I feel bad about it.
Yeah, I feel bad, so I'm one of the good guys.
Yeah.
But putting those high-minded egalitarian ideals onto paper, even if they didn't intend to live by them, it had unintended consequences. Right. Because hypocrisy in a legal framework acts as a powerful double-edged sword. On one side, sure, it allowed enslavers to wring their hands and maintain the status quo.
Right.
But on the other side, by writing all men are created equal into founding documents, they inadvertently forged a weapon. They created a legal and philosophical crack in the system, and enslaved people immediately saw that crack and drove a wedge into it.
Wait, really? So did anyone actually manage to use those lofty words against the founders in a court of law back then?
They absolutely did, by taking the founders literally at their word.
Wow.
The text details the remarkable story of Elizabeth Freeman, who was also known as Mum Bet.
Okay.
She was an enslaved woman in Massachusetts, and after enduring a horrific assault, her enslaver's wife actually struck her with a hot shovel.
Oh my God.
Yeah, but after that, she heard the brand new Massachusetts state constitution being read aloud. And this was a document declaring that all men are born free and equal. So she didn't just listen to the rhetoric, she weaponized it. She found a lawyer, sued for her freedom under that new constitution, and she won.
That is incredible. She basically forced the legal system to either admit it was entirely fraudulent or grant her freedom.
Exactly.
And the sources point out she wasn't the only one taking these ideals literally. There's the story of Paul and John Cuff, two mixed-race mariners from Massachusetts. In 1780, they were thrown in jail because they refused to pay their taxes. And their reasoning, as men of color, they were barred from voting, so they simply deployed the founders' own rallying cry, no taxation without representation, right back at the state government.
It's brilliant. These actions prove the vocabulary of the revolution possessed an undeniable power.
Right.
I mean, the men who drafted these words might have intended them for very exclusive white property-owning club. But once those words were out in the world, marginalized people used them to demand entry into that club.
Okay, so if the vocabulary was that powerful, and if enslaved and free Black Americans were successfully proving that these ideals applied to them, why didn't abolition become the bedrock of the new nation?
That is the big question.
Because I read in the text that earlier on, around 1774, ending the slave trade was actually a pretty popular idea among the colonists. They even called it a great object of desire. But by 1775, that momentum just vanishes. What happened?
The momentum was deliberately squandered by patriot leaders. And the turning point revolves around something called Lord Dunmore's proclamation.
Lord Dunmore.
Right, Robert G. Parkinson's essay explores this shift. Lord Dunmore was the royal governor of Virginia, and facing a growing rebellion, he played his most devastating card. He issued a proclamation threatening to free and arm any enslaved person willing to fight against the rebellious colonists.
Wow, that must have sent absolute shockwaves through the colonies.
Oh, it fundamentally altered the psychological landscape.
Yeah.
The abstract debate over liberty was entirely eclipsed by the immediate visceral terror of armed slave revolts. And you can actually trace this panic directly into the drafting of the Declaration of Independence. When Jefferson wrote his initial rough draft, he included a massive, highly emotional paragraph laying the blame for the execrable commerce of the slave trade squarely at the feet of King George.
Oh, I remember seeing pictures of that draft. He was practically shouting on the page, using heavy underlines in all caps.
Yeah, he poured a tremendous amount of moral outrage into it. But when the draft went to the wider Congress, they entirely excised that anti-slavery grievance.
They just stripped it out.
Stripped it completely. And in its place, right at the climax of the document, they inserted a brief, terrifying clause. They accused the king of inciting domestic insurrections amongst them and of bringing on the merciless Indian savages.
So they completely swap out an argument against the slave trade for an argument rooted entirely in racial terror.
And that reveals the harsh mechanism behind the founding. The Patriot leaders calculated that high-minded philosophical arguments about liberty were simply too weak to bind 13 radically different colonies together against the British Empire.
They needed a common enemy.
Exactly. They needed something much stronger. They realized that weaponizing the fear of slave insurrections and Native American attacks was the most effective way to mobilize ordinary white colonists. Fear, not idealism, became the ultimate unifier.
Man. And because they made that calculated choice to protect slavery in the name of unity, they inherited a massive ideological nightmare the moment the war ended.
Absolutely.
They had to figure out what to do with Black Americans and their new empire of liberty. Which takes me back to something mentioned about the 1976 bicentennial.
Okay, yeah.
President Gerald Ford gave this big speech at Monticello where he claimed the United States was a nation of immigrants, uniquely designed to absorb anyone from anywhere. And he awkwardly tried to retroactively fit Black Americans into this welcoming narrative, making it sound like diversity was always the plan.
It was a very modern attempt to project, a 20th century concept of a multicultural democracy back onto the 18th century.
Exactly. But the essay by Krista Dirkscheid and Nicholas Guyot pushes back on that immigration myth hard. When you actually read Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia, the founders' long-term plan wasn't absorption. It was population replacement. They wanted to systematically banish freed Black people from the United States entirely and then import white European laborers to take their place. They weren't trying to absorb anyone. They were trying to engineer a white republic.
And if there is any temptation to think that a multiracial abolitionist republic was simply impossible given the politics of the era, the text provides a stunning counterexample.
Oh.
Yeah, Marlene L. Dodd's essay draws a direct contrast between the American failure and the reality of what was unfolding in French Saint-Domingue at that exact moment. The Haitian Revolution succeeded where the American Revolution stalled. In 1804, Haiti declared its independence. And just a year later, the 1805 Imperial Constitution of Haiti included a sentence that is breathtaking in its clarity.
What did it say?
Slavery is forever abolished.
Wow. Just a completely unambiguous declaration. No loopholes, no hypocrisy.
None. Haiti proves beyond a doubt that immediate total abolition was not some impossible futuristic pipe dream. It was a fully actionable policy in the late 18th and early 19th centuries.
The American founders just didn't want to do it.
They simply lacked the courage or the desire to do it. And what is perhaps most tragic is how the American government reacted. Instead of embracing a sister republic that was actually fulfilling the promises of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson was horrified.
Right.
He saw the Haitian example as a massive threat to the American slave system, and he placed a punishing trade embargo on the new nation.
The contrast is staggering. And the fallout from that failure to reconcile our founding ideals with our racial realities, it isn't just something trapped in old letters.
No, it's very present.
It was physically constructed, cast in bronze, and placed directly into the American landscape, which leads us to look at how we memorialize this history, drawing from the essay by Allison Bigelow and Teresa R. Polak. We have to talk about Charlottesville, Virginia in the summer of 2017. And I want to be clear here with you listening, looking at the author's lived experiences and the historical analysis they provide in the book. We are just imparting the deeply painful events they documented where white supremacists marched through the University of Virginia campus.
Right, often referred to as the Summer of Hate.
That's right. You had people marching with tiki torches, chanting blood and soil, and it culminated in a horrific act of domestic terrorism where a counter-protester, Heather Heyer, was murdered. Now, much of the national conversation around that violence centered on Confederate monuments, but the authors in our source text turn our attention to a different monument at UVA, the George Rogers Clark statue.
And that statue serves as a masterclass in how historical memory is artificially manufactured. The monument was erected in 1921, so it was bankrolled by a wealthy businessman during the peak of the Jim Crow era. Visually, it depicted George Rogers Clark triumphantly mounted on a horse, pointing weapons directly at Native American figures huddled below him.
It's just...
And it included a woman holding a baby in a cradleboard.
Just a brutally violent, dominating image to place in the center of a university campus. And the wildest part is that the myth the statue was projecting didn't even align with the historical facts.
Not at all. The inscription hailed him as the conqueror of the Northwest. But the historical reality is that no such conquest took place.
Right.
The indigenous populations of that region weren't vanquished. They adapted, they formed alliances, and they survived. Furthermore, Clark's most notable victory in 1779 wasn't a display of brilliant military tactics.
What was it?
It was a horrific civilian massacre at Vincennes, where he had Ottawa and Lenape captives tomahawked to death and thrown into a river specifically to spread psychological terror.
So the university was hosting a monument that basically glorified a false narrative of white supremacy masquerading as frontier heroism.
Exactly.
The statue stood for a century, but the authors detail that in July 2021, it was finally removed. What really stands out in this essay, though, is how the university handled the aftermath. They didn't just rip the bronze off the pedestal and leave an empty patch of grass. They engaged in something called a trauma-informed ring theory consultation process. Hold on, ring theory.
Yeah.
I've heard the phrase, but how does that actually work in practice when you're deciding what to do with a controversial space?
So think of it like ripples in a pond.
Yeah.
In a ring theory process, you identify the people who are most directly harmed or affected by the trauma. In this case, Native American students in the Virginia tribes.
Okay.
And you place them in the very center ring of the decision-making process. Support flows inward to them, and they dictate the direction of the healing. By centering the tribes, the university completely changed the dynamic.
Yeah.
Instead of a monument to violent conquest, the tribes chose to replace the site with a curated living botanical garden featuring indigenous plants. It transformed a space of erasure into a space of relation and survival.
So if you are listening right now, walking past monuments in a local park or a city square, the authors are offering a really profound lens. Statues and monuments rarely tell the truth about the era they are depicting.
No, almost never.
They tell us almost everything about the anxieties and the power structures of the era they were built. A statue of an 18th century frontiersman erected in 1921 tells you volumes about 1920s Jim Crow politics and very little about the 1770s.
It forces us to walk through our cities and ask whose version of history is being permanently frozen in bronze and whose reality is being actively paved over.
That is such a good question. Let's take a breath and zoom out to summarize the journey we've been on, because it is a lot to process.
It really is.
The American Revolution we've explored today is not a static myth. It cannot be adequately captured on a bicentennial fast food placemat or smoothed over in a campaign speech. The sources show us a founding that was deeply contingent, incredibly messy, and driven by a potent mix of paradoxes, economic hypocrisy, and profound racial fear.
And yet, amidst all that calculation and cruelty, the architects of the revolution still managed to unleash a vocabulary of liberty that fundamentally altered the world. Because almost immediately, marginalized people from Elizabeth Freeman using the courts to the Cuff brothers demanding representation, they seized that vocabulary.
Right.
They forced the nation to look in the mirror and demanded that it try to live up to its own impossible hype.
Which brings me to a final, slightly provocative thought for you to mull over, sparked by an essay from Brendan McConville. We spend so much time today expecting the founders to be infallible.
Yeah.
But the revolutionary generation themselves firmly believed that human beings were deeply inherently flawed. They did not trust human nature. And that is exactly why they designed a political framework meant to accommodate failure and reinvention.
Right.
They built a system that allows for bankruptcies, for sweeping elections, for amendments, and for constant structural change.
They constructed an engine for progress, even if they lacked the moral courage to fully operate it themselves.
Right. So as we get closer and closer to the 250th anniversary of this whole grand, chaotic experiment, maybe we need to reframe how we view the current culture wars. The fact that we are still fiercely arguing over their legacy, the fact that people are tearing down false narratives, replacing violent statues with living gardens, and demanding a much more honest accounting of our past. Well, actually, wait, I can't say it like that. The fact that we are doing all these things, maybe that ongoing struggle is the most authentic way to honor the true spirit of 1776.
I think so.
History isn't a flawless blueprint. It's a loud, messy, endless construction site. And maybe grabbing a hard hat and getting into the mud is exactly what we are supposed to do. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.